please welcome our own Dr. Chris Marsh.
Thank you, Craig. It's always an interesting challenge for me to talk to this group because I know we have a mixture of people that this may be their first talk that they've heard me do, and there's others of you that have lost count. One of the things I'll do is try to make sure I cover the really important stuff quickly. The only rule is if you snore too loud for the person next to you, you may get elbowed. What I want to do this evening is really talk about not so much exactly what you see on the property, but the philosophy and the science that goes into the decision-making process. And in that, I hope you'll have a better idea of then understanding why Spring Island is managed the way it is. And to do that, I'm really going to take you back through my career as a professional ecologist. And during the last 50 years, there's 5 key questions that have been discussed in the scientific community that all apply to Spring Island. The first is the whole concept of how do you look at a habitat or a system and measure its value. And we talk about productivity and biodiversity. And when we talk about that, what's the difference? The second sounds sort of simplistic, but it ended up in being a lot more complicated than we imagined. And a scientist one time asked his students at the University of Michigan in the mid-1950s, why are trees green? And the answer was not because of chlorophyll. And also, why are fields so productive? The third one is to help us in our time scale to understand what to expect from nature. So we say nature's unit of time here is the lifespan of a tree. And we'll try to see what that means for Spring Island. The fourth one is that we're doing more and more work about animals that I'm calling game changers. These are often referred to as Keystone Species, and they talk about trophic cascading. And we have a couple of examples of those in action here on Spring Island. And the last one is size matters. How big should a nature preserve be? So with that, let's get started with the first one, productivity and biodiversity. What's the difference? And in case you fall asleep, just remember this. When we talk about productivity, it's all about calories, or counting individuals. When it's biodiversity, it's counting species. And this really shaped how Spring Island developed in terms of its habitats. Now we have some characters here that illustrate they could do biodiversity, but in this case it's high productivity. And that is, in about the 1930s, the field of wildlife biology and fisheries management was born. And the idea was that by that time there had been such a reduction in wild populations, they disappeared from areas, that people wanted to know how to bring them back. So the goal here was how can you manage an area to have plenty of fish to catch like we used to. We also asked how can we manage habitats so we can have plenty of game birds that we can hunt like we used to. And so biologists in this field, wildlife biology and fisheries, really started trying to understand habitats. And the assumption under this is because you're trying to raise as large a crop as possible of some selected species, that was high productivity. And that was to assume things from the bottom up. So if you want a lot of something, make sure that you have a lot of food for it to eat. Now they recognized that there were these things called varmints. And varmints were things that ate some of your quail or your fish. So if somebody around here talks about, hey, wait a minute, that osprey's taking my fish, you're interested in high productivity. Okay, just remember that. Now, culturally, the southern plantations were a really important destination because hunting was an avid social sport for men and women when it came to bird hunting. And this is a woman who was, in her younger years, there was an avid bird hunter. People knew her, recognized her easier later by her husband. This is Carol Lombard and some other guy. And so, just want to know, this was, you didn't have MTV, you didn't have TV, and so when you traveled to a destination, it was a place, and they were trying to manage habitats for several species, but the ones that you could hunt. That continued here on Spring Island. This is what Spring Island looked like when I first came in 1993. That's Mobley Oaks Lane. Those young live oaks are the oaks along the lane. And quail hunting was still a major pastime and a reason to rent the entire island and use it for your group. If you're interested in managing habitat for quail, which was the goal of Spring Island, you wanted to have lots of fields, because quail were field birds, and they needed to have fairly open fields to run through. So you plowed your fields or disked your fields every year or so to make sure there were lots of weeds, but they weren't too thick. And in the oak forest, you bush hogged. You know, the bush hog is that big mower behind a tractor. And Gordon used to say, if somebody's at work on Spring Island, somebody's also running the bush hog. So the idea is that quail needed open habitats, so they maintained the island as open as possible. So that's the emphasis of productivity. Now, biodiversity turned out became a real interesting topic in a totally different building in the university. And that was for the zoology department. So the fisheries and wildlife people were in one building, sometimes in one school. They might be in the School of Ag. All right? And the zoologist, which is where there was no such thing as an ecology degree. You either got a degree in zoology or botany. So when I started graduate school in 1977 at Oregon State, there was the wildlife biologist across the road, and then there were the people that studied ecology and the biodiversity. They both studied habitats, but one was about productivity, the other one was about biodiversity. And the professors couldn't get along no matter what. And we grad students had great parties together. Now, so with biodiversity, what you're interested in is how much richness. And so in the 1960s, the papers that we were reading, particularly when I got to grad school, was why are there so many species in some habitats compared to other habitats? And in particular, they're interested in different habitats, support different kinds of species, which leads us up to the fact that Spring Island, if you want to talk to somebody else and say, what's Spring Island about? You can tell them it is the most species-rich barrier island or sea island in the southeastern United States, by far. And it also, particularly if you include the salt marsh that's around it. The reason being is because of its topography combined with its history. So very briefly, geologically, Spring Island was created as a barrier island with very high dunes. Shoreline was about 90,000 years ago while sea level was still dropping. As sea level dropped, a series of barrier islands got formed in front of it, which is what's illustrated at the bottom. Notice at the top how there's a swale, and it says, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little trees there. That's a freshwater habitat in the middle of the island. So that's the basic, you have good bones, so to speak, for this island. Now, this was something else going on here that's not shown in that illustration, and that is if you look right here, do you see that structure?
Yeah.
That's a little island created by an old garbage pit. That's where all the oyster shells were thrown by the Indians for thousands of years. Now, as sea level has risen, it's covered most of that. But you see these little loops, these are called middens, M-I-D-D-E-N-E-N-S. That's a nice word scientists use as for a garbage dump. And so these created also unique habitats. By the way, this little Middens Island, all of you walked on it. I don't know if anybody can tell where this is, but let me just show you for comparison. There it is today. That's that little hummock there out at the shrimp pond. Why in the world would there be a little island out there? All right, and you walk around out there, it's hard. That's all oyster shell underneath. So that's the other thing that she talks about, adding diversity to our landscape. So one of the first things I did when I got here, because I came from the zoology school, not from the wildlife school, was that we had to document how many habitats we had. So first thing we had to do is we had to get Spring Island mapped with what we call GIS, the mapping that everybody takes for granted now with Google. Google Maps did not exist back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. So we had to bring somebody in who knew how to do that, hired somebody to come in who could walk the island, map the habitats. The left-hand side shows the detailed map of habitats, how many different habitats there are on Spring Island. This was in 2005. And on the right-hand side is how we sort of simplified it into categories. But one of the things I want you to take away with is because of its diversity, Spring Island is like a patchwork quilt in terms of its habitats and its characteristics. So now let's go back and look at those fields I talked about with high productivity. We're really interested in managing fields in different ways to maintain high diversity. You see all the different types of fields we have on Spring Island? And we'll come back to why that's the benefit there. But this then becomes the focus on trying to maximize species. And you say, well, what about the quail? Can we keep managing for quail? One of the things I need to tell you is to support a covey of quail, you need 1,200 acres of open fields. All right? We have 3,000 acres total. So if you wanted to look at everybody's house on Spring Island, you can see that that'd be a bit of a challenge. And those quail that are on Spring Island were pen raised in the art barn. That used to be the quail motel. And so then they were released. So they released, most plantations released 20,000, 30,000 pen raised quail a year to maintain the support. So now we're into diversity. One of the things I want you to look at is look at this field. How many different colors and patterns in all these cities? So we get high diversity within these fields. And this is because this field has been allowed to grow and not be disc. It's about 3 years old. So if you let your fields age, then you'll end up with a different structure. So some fields get plowed regularly, strips, some get plowed longer, but you want to make sure they don't go too long. And just to illustrate, I want you to notice how these animals blend into their backgrounds. This is one that's found anywhere you have leaves. People have sometimes this walks through the yard in the middle of the winter. If you do, call me, I'll tell you what it is. Nickname's Timberdoodle. Everybody see the bird here? This picture was taken right near the Mason's house, right at the entrance of Covey Rise. And if you can't tell, that's a bird sitting on a nest and had 3 chicks, and that's what it looks like close up. That's your Chuck Will's widow. Here's a white-eyed vireo on the nest. This is one of the most common birds in Spring Island. Everybody's nature curtain has this in the summer. And of course, you can find the animal here. Talking about, I think, one of great Tom Blagden's photographs. And it's not surprising that our fox squirrels are the color of oak bark. The black ones blend in with burnt pine trunks. Now then, so how do we respond to this? What the Spring Island Trust does is we have a map and we have 28 management units. And we have a notebook. Every year, we just finished in August, we go through and visit each of these, evaluate it, see how our management's going, make recommendations for what we're going to do next. And one of Whitfield's, Marshall's jobs is to keep up with what we're doing, where, and when. In the fall, we'll have a meeting with our outside consultants, go through what we're doing, and it's sort of like an environmental audit is the best way I can describe it. So, productivity and biodiversity are important. This is a nature preserve island. Exploration and discovery is a key part. So we're trying to make sure there's always something new for you to discover. With that, let's build upon that and look at the next question where we said, why are trees green and fields productive? This takes you into the zoology building even more. And in 1956, Dr. Ken Smith asked his University of Michigan class, why are trees green? And when they said chlorophyll, he said, no, that's not what I'm talking about. The fact is, we know that insects can multiply at exponential rates. And he was asking the question, why don't insects become so abundant that they eat all the leaves of all the trees? And the fact is that the trees can even keep their leaves. Now, being an animal bias, what they thought at that time is it must be the birds. And that the birds keep eating all these insects. And it led to all sorts of interesting experiments. Some of them we would cause people to cringe today. In Canada, they put out 10-acre plots and they removed all the breeding songbirds and they measured the insects before and after. And what they discovered from that is it didn't matter how many birds you shot off a territory, there were always extra breeders. And they had to stop the experiment, and that's when they learned about floaters, the fact that every bird population that's healthy has, for every breeding pair, there's probably 5 or 10 birds waiting to take that pair that don't have a territory. But then when they started looking at it, it turned out that they were barking up the wrong tree, so to speak, because the entomologists got involved, and basically it turned out that the plants were defending themselves. It was a matter of chemical warfare, and you've heard maybe about some of this. But in particular, on these sandy islands, it's really critical because on sandy islands, the soil's acidic. It's hard to get the nutrients out of the soil, and so as a tree, once it makes its leaves, it does want to keep making more. So it fills them with tannins and makes them basically like styrofoam. So you can have lots and lots of green leaves, but there's nothing for the caterpillars to eat. And so right here we have a forest that is dominated by laurel oak, water oak, wax myrtle, yopon holly, and the bird diversity is very low because there's so little food there. Now, this is, we'll talk about how we get there. In contrast, when new young leaves come out, the first thing the plant does is make tree leaves that don't have many chemicals in it. They're trying to grow up, and so much of the caterpillar's life cycle is often coordinated to get to those leaves right first thing in the spring before they get the chemicals in them. If no caterpillars chew on the leaves, they don't make the chemicals. And they discovered this because a guy was wanting to look at how much chemicals were in these leaves, and he was collecting the leaves off a plant, and the more leaves he picked off the plant, the more chemicals it made. It turned out he was acting like a caterpillar. He was one very frustrated graduate student when I talked to him in 1982. So now we understand that certain plants make certain chemicals, and then there will be certain insects that will have the enzymes to break down those chemicals in that plant. So now we have caterpillars that are specialized to eat certain plants because different plants make different chemicals. And in the case, this is one of my favorite, this is a very common butterfly on Spring Island called the spice bush swallowtail. It eats sassafras, so we have a lot of sassafras here. And I love the caterpillar. Those big spots are on its back. So when it gets bothered, it rears up its head and looks like a snake to try to scare the birds off. So think about, where are you going to find the most caterpillars? In a mature forest here that's on a sandy ridge, or in a field. In a field, there's a totally different strategy. Here the plants are weeds. What they're doing is there's a disturbed area, they're growing as fast as they can, they don't put much energy into chemicals because they're putting all their energy into flowers and then seeds, because they're going to produce a large number of seeds so that they can spread and find the other open places. So in these areas now we have lots of juicy stuff. This is sort of the whole foods market from a bird standpoint. And as a result, there's a high diversity of butterflies in here. When you see lots of butterflies, I want you to think lots of caterpillars. Lots of caterpillars mean that these areas can be highly productive for not just insects, but can everybody see the mammal in here? There's the mouse. So you get healthy rodent populations. This is a native deer mouse, and therefore our bobcats and birds of prey love to hunt these fields as well. There is one field on Spring Island that's extra special to us, though, because it was set up during the era of high productivity. Not only did they want to hunt quail, but they also wanted to hunt ducks. So what Elijah Walker did in the design was, remember that swale area I talked about? This was an area that was too wet to farm, so they built a dike around the area, put in a set of ditches and fields, and they put in a deep well, so they could pump water out of the steep well, send it through the ditches, and flood these fields. And so in the summer, they would raise corn in it, then mow down the corn, and then flood it in the winter in time for the ducks to arrive. That worked back in the 1960s when ducks still came south, but things changed. Here's a video, if I can get it to run, J.J. Kaiser was very kind enough to make, just to give you a perspective of what it looks like from the drone. So see these fields, see the ditches there? And in particular where you see the lines of trees, those are where the canals are. And so this is in the winter when they've been flooded. And you can see that it's actually a set of 3 fields, and there's 3 rows of them. The roads also act as the dikes, and there's dikes that surround them. So get a little sense of perspective, because I wanted you to see how it's laid out. When you walk through there, it's hard to see what it's like. You can go to Google Maps and explore this as well. So how do we get these fields like this? Well, this is the same process that occurs in our regular fields, but what we're doing this time of year right now is in the summer when it's dry, we get in there with the bush hog and we make sure that there's strips that we're open up, and we will also disc that. And as a result, we make sure that in those fields the weeds don't get too high, the vegetation get too high, that when we flood it, now you see we have some areas where the ducks can feed in open water, the wood storks can wade, and there's also places for the birds to hide. The wooded habitats are also very important, but that's another story. Just to illustrate the kind of dynamics that are going on among plants and chemical warfare and management, here is a picture of an area at the south end of Spring Island taken in 1994. And at that time they were very excited because they found some clumps of trillium. This is what it looked like on Spring Island. That's the way you found trillium in the early 1990s. There were just individual clumps here and there, and there was lots of yopon holly growing through the area. So what they decided to do, so that you can see the trillium better, is that in the fall when there was no trillium and it was wintertime, they came in and they bush hogged and mowed the area. And once they started doing that, something happened. The trillium started to spread. And basically what we think happens is that in some plants, like, and we think yopon holly may be this. Nobody's ever looked at this. This is a hypothesis based upon what we saw. Is we know some plants release chemicals through their roots that suppress the growth of other plants. And black walnuts are characteristic of that. So after they'd done that about 5 years, this is what the place looked like. So when you go down and you see the trillium garden that is being managed, that's because every 3 years we go in and we bush hog it in November, December. We used to do it every year, and we found out there were some extremely rare sedges that were disappearing that used to be common there. So we went to a 3-year cycle because that gives them time to complete their life cycle. And we would have never known that if we didn't have one of the premier botanists for the Southeast being part of our team that visited. So we now have a sense about why plants are green, how that affects where the butterflies are, the caterpillars, and the birds. Let's now talk about the fact that, it'd be nice. Are there situations where you have trees and the weedy plants at the same place at the same time, or the field plants at the same time? And the answer is yes. It's in the southeast. They're called pine savannas. If you look on the left, this is an unmanaged area where we're doing prescribed burn, and on the right is where it's been opened up, and you can see how the diversity there. In order to maintain this, basically where you would find the after picture, that's what old growth pine savanna looks like in its native state with their regular prescribed burns. We really don't want to wait 300 years for this to occur on its own. We can accelerate that process if we go in and we remove the smaller trees, leaving the biggest trees there so that they have more space to grow, and now there's plenty of sunlight to get between the trees, which is what happens in nature. And we continue our prescribed burn program. If you're new to the south from some other part of the country, particularly the north or even the west, one of the things that's important to understand is the southeastern coastal plain burdens on a regular schedule because of pine straw and grasses. Hanging pine straw is what burns. And it's not a matter of if it will burn, it's when we burn. So by doing prescribed burns, we keep the amount of fuel down and we can control it. They didn't do that up where I moved from Myrtle Beach area, and they just said, we can build a housing community out here in this kind of habitat, and 67 homes burned up one year. All right, so let me just take you through the process. Some of you have seen these pictures before, but you've got new eyes. When it's shady, you don't tend to have grasses, you tend to have broadleaf plants. So you see you've got a lot of oaks and wax myrtles here because it's shady. Look at all the little trees, okay? Then we go in and we do a timber harvest, and And at first it looks, oh my gosh, what did you do? This is a nature center. But you see we've left trees. Those were the biggest ones. Okay, we took out the smaller ones. 2 years later, this is during a drought. We're dominated by grasses. And these are the winter native grasses, which means you can crawl around in there. There's lots of space underneath, and it's a great place to hide if you're baby turkey or your small birds. This is the same area 4 years later. The drought is over. And you see the diversity coming in? All right, this is at Big Neck. This is a similar area, Osprey Woods, after the hurricane. And this area, type of habitat, survived the hurricane extremely well because the trees had been allowed to grow nice and strong. They had plenty of sunlight, plenty of root space, and they were well spaced. So we had very little problem in these habitats during the hurricane. If you're burning on a regular basis, you have a problem potentially about how do you get little pine trees to start up when there's fire. But there is a pine that is adapted for living with fire. And I always ask the question, what did Spring Island look like before there was Sea Island cotton? And in my explorations, when I first got here, I found some longleaf pines that were over 100 years old. So that confirmed the fact with this high sandy ridge, probably there was a significant amount of longleaf pine. And the way you tell it is because they're very flat-top trees. So they get to a certain height and then they just grow this way. I know that doesn't sound familiar to anybody, but pines do that at least. And I can give you some articles to read, but the cycle is the fact that they grow root systems first, so where they're protected from sun, they have a big crown of wet needles that are full of water that protect the bud when the fire comes through. And this picture on the right is from the Gulf, where they have richer soils than here. But the idea is this was 92 million acres of the southeast was longleaf pine. And they said you could take a carriage and ride through the forest. It was so open from Georgetown to Charleston if you were here in the 1800s. So here's what they look like. I always think they look like Cousin It from the Addams Family. And so you can recognize them. So by planting longleaf pine, what we're doing is we're setting up for the next generations that it's very easy for us to maintain the island with prescribed burns. The standard practice when I got here, if you wanted to start longleaf pine, is they came in and they planted them in rows. These are the wildlife biology people, high productivity people. Because you could get tractors through it. And I said, we don't want this to look like a tree farm. So if you go down below Star Mountain, there's still a set of these here, and those were the very first trees we were planting, and we said, we're not going to do that anymore. Out in nature, a tree falls over, you get a gap about the size of this room, and all the youngsters pop up there. I said, from now on, and they grow shaped with the ones in the middle of the tallest, so they call it a dome. And so having spent so much time out in the field, I said, let's start planting domes. And our consultant kind of looked like, you're a heretic. But they went along with it because we were paying them. And so here is a dome that was planted in 2008, I believe. This is right next to the clay range. If you go toward the end of the range, you'll see it there. And this is where we had the deck, and it had been cleared completely. These grow very slowly the first 3 or 4 years, but once they get about 6 or 7 years, they bolt up. Now, when we brought the consultants in, they said, it's fine for you to have longleaf pine, but what really makes a longleaf pine forest is that rich diversity of plants underneath. And it's the ground cover. You've got good cover, but I see a problem. And he pointed out to that grass in the circle, and he said, that's Bahia grass. What you did on a plantation is you planted Bahia grass, which is a pasture grass, along the roads because you thought the bobwhite quail liked the seeds, and they would eat them. But it's a pasture grass, so it'll cover things and fill up your natural areas. So now we have a dilemma. We never even thought to look for it out in our reestablished pine forest. So we go through now, and we talk about herbicides. We're very judicious with how we use them, but we have to do spot spraying with herbicides to kill these invasive plants. Roundup is in a lot of topics right now. Let me just give you a real quick thing. They're Roundup-ready crops. What that means is that they put the genes in them so that they can handle Roundup and it won't kill them. That means you can spray a lot of Roundup on these crops and kill the weeds that are growing with them. Okay, so it's not the crop that has the Roundup, it's the resistance they have to it. Those are the situations where they now are suggesting that Roundup, we know it doesn't hurt animals. There's nothing in Roundup that affects human or animal biochemical pathways, but it does affect bacterial pathways, and it's that gut flora thing. And it turns out with the honeybees and some of these pollinators, they're now thinking that it's messing up their guts, just like all that sugar that I'm not supposed to eat. And red meat can mess up, give us problems gut-wise for humans. Now, when we talk about disturbances, there is another way to get weedy plants out in the forest, and that is to have a hurricane. And actually, a hurricane really helped the health of the forest, of the nature preserves on Spring Island. Because, remember all those trees I said were on the sand ridges that had high tannin leaves? There's the ones that toppled over. And when they toppled over, because we were able to clean many of them out and get those areas, we now have gaps of sunlight. So when you go through the area and you see these patches of green weeds, I want you to think of every one of those as a caterpillar factory. And you can watch the number of butterflies in those areas, and those are where the birds, the songbirds particularly, get their meals. So trees are green because they have lots of chemicals. Fields are productive because they don't, and they're just going full gusto until they reproduce. Now then, let's put all this and let's put it into motion and go through a time scale of Spring Island. In 1850, the tax map showed that 70% of Spring Island was sea island cotton fields. The people that visited said you could see from one end of the island to another. And they said it was like an African savanna. There were no forests here, with a few exceptions. So think about this. When these fields were abandoned in 1863, there was a big estate dispute over Spring Island that didn't get settled until almost 1900. And so these fields grew up in weeds. And these weeds were perfect for quail. And so all of these abandoned fields that have been abandoned anywhere from 1 to 10 years ago are ideal quail habitat. That's why there were so many quail in Beaufort County, because most of Beaufort County was not forested. It was cotton fields. Now, one of the things we know is one of the first trees to get into these clearings are young loblolly pines. You all have nature curtains, you know all about that. The pros of that is it's hard to see your neighbor through there. So it makes a nice thicket. It doesn't look real pretty, okay? So if you're looking and say, I want the aesthetics, your neighbor may not like it if you put a fire through it, okay? But this is the process of change. When you see young pine trees, I want you to know that that was a clearing just a short time ago. Now, the other thing you can do about understanding these fields is you can look at the really large live oaks. If a really large live oak is lopsided, like this one, that tells you it grew at the edge of the field. If you look at this one, look at the right-hand side. What direction are all the branches growing? Do you see how they're growing horizontally? Branches grow toward light. In contrast, if you look at the left-hand side, there's very few branches there, and the ones that are there are growing up. So that was where the forest was. So the left-hand side of the tree was forested, the right-hand side was the field, so this live oak grew up at the edge of the field, and you can go through the woods today and find these big live oaks in rows that are otherwise surrounded by laurel oaks. Let's do a time warp. We have an aerial photograph of Spring Island from 1959. Now what happened in the 1900s was that it was quail hunting in the first part, and then it was used for timber harvest. They bring barges over, and then it was to cut trees for limp timber, and they had free-range hogs and pigs in the 1950s. That's how it was used in the 40s and 50s. So in 1959, I want you to notice how much open space there is in some areas, and how there's a lot of dense trees in other places. Does everybody recognize their neighborhood? This is Tebby Link's neighborhood. Those are the fields, and see that little line of trees that stick through the middle? That's the oak outlet. That's where the Edwards ruins are. Yeah. So, and notice that much of this area to the north of that is now forest. Here's the, for those of you that live in Walker houses, landing. Here is the picture I showed you before. There's Pinckney Point out there. And this is where the Walkers lived during the 1960s. And here's the southern end of the island in Bonnie Shore. And you can, if you look carefully, can you see a big square where there used to be a field? All right, and Bonnie Shore, and look how open it is over there in the Goose Pond Circle area. And then you can also see that where there used to be a field, kind of a rhombus right there in the middle. All right, so this was all 1959. This is why it's so significant that Elijah Walker came in the 1960s and designed a series of fields that would be cut out of this pattern here so it could be used for quail hunting. So the design, the footprint, the places that the fields are, the template that we have for Spring Island today is pretty much the result of the foresight and investment of Elijah Walker and the firm that he hired to do that. So let's go back. When you now look at this picture I showed you before and you see an area with a lot of laurel oak and this scrub, you know, that used to be old cotton fields, or it was fields in the 1940s. This forest right here, those trees could be 40 years old. All right, and right off the bat, you said, oh, that's not that old, you told on yourself, or if you said that is old, then don't rub it in the face of the rest of us. And with that, though, with all this farming, there were some places that were not suitable for farming because the water table was too close to the surface. And one of them was Big Neck, and that was the area I showed you before. So Big Neck has the same kind of plants that would have been here before people were ever here, and the Indians probably walked through this same kind of habitat. There was also a section on Straight Road that has clay near the surface. It has a perch water table, and it's also next to the Waterfall Farms. See that stretch of woods there? That habitat there indicates to us that it wasn't farmed as well. Again, perch water table. If anybody's seen Waterfall Farms during an El Nino winter, and how the water can just stand there, that lets you know. The third area is what we call Chichesi Bottoms. It's a seepage area that's at the end of along Live Oak Forest, the road, and up near Palmetto Point. And it has a remnant forest that originally was established there probably 18 to 10,000 years ago when the Broad River was a cypress swamp. So it's unique as well. There's a little bird that's very nondescript named after that place up in Maine called the Acadian Forest. Acadian flycatcher that likes where there's a lot of trees that are wetland trees because those trees have nice leaves that are not hard like the other ones and were caterpillars. And these three red areas that you see are places where Acadian flycatchers breed, and all of them have a ravine and have tulip poplar growing in them and trees that are very different from the ones I showed you on those sand ridges. Now, before we talk about the fact that when hurricanes blow things down, things happen. And so these gaps also tell us about how you get an old age forest. An old growth forest is one where the forest has been around long enough that trees have fallen over, died, new trees have come up and matured, and so you end up with multiple generations together. And in our area, that takes several hundred years to occur. The other pattern you can see reading time occurs in our wetlands. Now, all our wetlands are old borrow pits. A borrow pit is a lie. A borrow pit is where the people say, I'm going to go borrow the dirt and use it for making a dike. And when I heard that kid, I said, well, when are you going to give it back? All right, so it's a pit where you dig the sand. So every time you see a dike, like the Great Salt Pond or somewhere like that, somewhere there's a hole in the ground where they got the sand and it's become a wetlands. What I want you to notice about this, and this was taken, the picture was taken last week, was notice all the dead stuff. This is what we now call Dragonfly Pond. It's near Star Mountain. And those are wax myrtles that have died by drowning. In 2009 to 2013, we had the drought of the century. And all these ponds dried up, bone dry, and plants started growing in them. And now that I've talked about how to look at things, I want you to use the pine trees. Look at this. This is along the edge of Dragonfly Pond. And I want you to notice how only little pines grew down the lower part of the bank. Now, listen, you know, they used to be underwater. When I came here in 1995, they were stocking what we now call Dragonfly Pond with striped bass. It was so deep. The problem was the water was so clear, the ospreys really appreciated it. You can tell that a pond has had water in it for at least 3 years if it has lily pads, because they don't come in till later. So with that, then, as you walk around, I want to have that the trees can tell you about the history of the place, and then we're trying to combine a mosaic of the old trees, keeping them special, but also we want the young habitats as well because they offer something different. Well, let's talk about the game changers. Those animals that can make a big difference in the way a forest or a habitat looks. If you're new to the island, don't get disturbed if you're out in August or in January and you see somebody going down the road in the middle of the night like this. First of all, Lisa Gravel's driving the truck. When people ask Lisa, what do you do for a living, and what does your job entail, she probably will just tell them about, well, the first day I was on the job, I thought I was a secretary. Chris got me in a truck and had to go catch a canebrake rattlesnake. But this is a spotlight survey. They're looking for deer and counting them to get an estimate of how abundant do we think deer are on Spring Island. And so managing a deer herd is extremely important. We do quality deer management. That means we have a select group of hunters that visitors are not, this is not a come bring your friends. This is a place, if you're going to hunt here, you got to be trained, you got to know exactly what you're doing. If you're a new member and you're interested in hunting, that's great. Call Peter Rude. We'll bring you into the fold. But what they want to do is they want to make sure that the bucks have a chance to mature so you have the best animals breeding. At the same time, you want to make sure your deer population does not get too dense. And let's talk about the reason for that. So this is practice. On the hunt, you have to be able to tell them. By the way, by the time a deer gets 6 years old, its teeth are worn down and it's on the way out. Literally, that's like a 90-year-old person who hasn't been brushing. Well, hey, it's like a 90-year-old person who hasn't had a toothbrush and hasn't been able to brush their teeth for those 90 years, okay? Somebody think, boy, I'm glad not their spouse. Here is a summary of the deer harvest since 1993, and one of the things you see, it goes up and down a lot. The kind of things that affect the number of deer taken will depend, for example, on whether it's a drought. Okay, what other food's available? If we have a huge acorn crop and the acorns fall, they don't want to eat corn, they'll go eat the acorns instead. If, on the other hand, we have a frost in April that kills the buds on the oaks, those buds are what's going to make the acorns. So one year we had a situation where deer were eating everything in everybody's yards, and they said we never had that problem before. That was the winter following an April frost, which wiped out all the acorns. And so there's all sorts of variables that are going on that can influence the deer population. Here's an experiment that was done, and y'all have all done it by planting things in your yard, which turned out just to feed the deer. But Whitfield had done some research, and so we planted sunflowers, and he put up a tape that has a deer repellent in it, and it also wavers in the wind. And if you see, the outside of the tape also had sunflowers planted. All right, so they planted the whole area and protected part of the field with this wavering tape, and part of the field was not protected. As you can see the impact of the deer? Yep. Now, deer need something to eat, and we want to have a healthy deer herd, but one of the things to keep in mind is when we lost the sunflower seeds, the sunflowers, we also lost the pollinators that went with them, and the other things that are eating them. One of the things that makes Spring Island so diverse is the diversity of wildflowers we have and young plants. And when I went to Fripp Island working with the bird club there, one of the things that I was very impressed with was what low diversity of songbirds they had. And when I started looking around, there was no dog fennel. You know those weedy places that you don't think look nice? They didn't have those places because everything was grazed down. So the idea of a game changer, what we call a keystone species, is by its presence, it not only affects what it's eating, but it has a domino or a cascading effect through each of the trophic levels or energy levels. So as a result, Fripp Island did not have the diversity of butterflies because they didn't have these nice little weedy, juicy plants that I've been showing you all along. Remember how we talked about trees are green and why fields are productive? As a result, I also had a hard time finding it in painted bunting. They did not have orchard orioles and blue grosbeaks out there. And also think about the fact that baby turkeys rely heavily on grasshoppers and caterpillars, which in turn require those weedy areas as well. So these are referred to as bugging areas. So these pictures are thanks to Carl Canzanelli. This is out his backyard. And so you see that effect. So you see what happens with the deer, of the fact that when we're trying to take care of the whole system in nature, things can have a dramatic effect on others. There's another game changer that relates to this bird. This is not the bird, but this is the indicator. If you haven't seen a wood duck, then there's a couple places to go. Ricegate Pond at daybreak. Gator Hole Pond has them. Of course, the duck ponds have them as well. If you get frustrated there's a while, just come to my neighbor. I live in Port Royal, and there's a boardwalk through a cypress swamp there, and the wood ducks get used to people, so I can go out there and watch them without binoculars first thing in the morning or late in the day. But wood ducks are a highly desirable species because they're pretty, and the babies are cute. They nest in wood duck boxes. And soon after I got here, somebody said, we need more wood ducks around here. Why don't we have more wood ducks? Let's put up more boxes. So I knew enough to know I didn't know what I didn't know. So I called one of my mentors from my previous life, Kenny Williams, who had run Ted Turner's plantation up in Georgetown for 20 years and worked for Ducks Unlimited. And the first thing I came, he said, Chris, you got a problem. This is the same guy that when I was 29 years old as a young producer said, son, let me tell you how it's going to be when you come to my plantation. I go, yes, sir. So Kenny gets down here and he says, what's the #1 predator for baby wood ducks? And we thought, alligators, snapping turtles? He said, nope. He said, they sit there and yes, if a duck swims by, they get them. He said, the #1 predator for wood ducks is largemouth bass. He said, the reason being is that a largemouth bass actively hunts the entire pond. And so even though a largemouth bass can only eat a baby wood duck for a few days, the fact that they're hunting the whole pond means that they'll eat up all your baby wood ducks. If you keep putting your wood duck boxes out in your golf course ponds. He said, you've got to put up your wood duck boxes in a place where you don't have fish. He said, do you have any place like that? I said, well, not exactly, but I think we can do something a little different to do that. And so what we did is we went to the duck ponds. Now, the way it had been set up before was they kept it dry in the summer, and in order to get it ready for planting, they always drained it in April because the ducks had left. And then they planted in corn, and when I first got here, they sprayed it for soldier worms with insecticides, which was highly toxic to the amphibians in the ditches. So I said, we're not doing that anymore. And so what we did is we shifted the flooding cycle of the duck ponds. We now keep watering the duck ponds through the 1st of June. And they are duck ponds no longer for attracting winter ducks, but for breeding wood ducks. And as a result of that practice, then we get a lot of other species as well. So that's a place where you don't have fish. So fish are a major top-down predator. And here's Bob Hochstetler giving the high five of how many are in the box. So they're checking the boxes here. And in addition to the duck ponds, we also have Dragonfly Pond and Tree Frog Pond that are now holding water because the water table's gone back up. And what applies to baby wood ducks also applies to a lot of other things. That's why these ponds have so many dragonflies. Water beetles, water bugs, is because they don't have fish. One of an unnamed member, who's not here tonight, one time came to me and said, hey, I did you a favor. I had some extra bass and I put them in Tree Frog Pond for you. It took me 3 years to kill those damn fish. You know? We got in the drought and it dried out. And so the point is, if you see these ponds with water, please don't do us a favor and stop them. Okay? You think you're doing some help, but that's the problem. And some people say, what about mosquitoes? These ponds are so full of diving beetles and predatory dragonfly nymphs and all that, you have far fewer mosquitoes when you're over at the duck ponds than when you're out in the woods and there's all these little shallow pools of water that don't have the aquatic areas. So those two examples are good examples of what we call a keystone species, a species who's up here and its actions affect multiple layers. Well, let's get down to the final one, size matters. I put that one in the end, I thought I might wake somebody up. And it said, how big should a nature preserve be? Keep in mind that Spring Island is 3,000 acres. When I first came here and they were bush hogging the forest open, they're the only species, somebody says, how good a job have you done with Spring Island in terms of managing it. I said, when I talked to Betsy Chafin in 1993, she asked me to be a consultant. I said, if you could develop Spring Island and not lose any breeding birds, then you would have been successful. With our management program, and because of the golf course bringing in aquatic habitats, the number of species on Spring Island has actually increased now of birds, and it certainly has for butterflies, compared to when the project was first started. There's one species that is no longer here, and that's the wood thrush. We used to have 5 or 6 areas that I found wood thrushes. I think it's a combination of the fact that all the nature curtains grew up. Wood thrushes are like robins. Robins are thrushes. They need open forest to hop through. And the other thing is that the wood thrush population has declined dramatically throughout the area. But when I started looking into it, Spring Island isn't even big enough to support a wood thrush population. We said quail need 1,200 acres and these thrushes need 5,000. So are we doomed? Well, this really illustrates the fact that when we look at preserving nature on Spring Island, we are not an island in the true biological sense. If you want to keep up with nature, one of the things we have to realize is that probably what happens in nature is these little populations, some will be thriving and something will happen somewhere and a local population will go extinct. So the uh-oh faces are on the way out, okay? There, the birds are coming to breed, but they're losing their offspring, and they're losing more birds or animals than they are gaining. In contrast, there are other bird populations set up hotspots, and they're producing lots of extras. And these extras disperse and repopulate the areas that were empty. And so the trick with habitat management in terms of long-term sustainability is you want to be part of a big system and make sure everything stays connected. This is why the Spring Island Trust is so dedicated to trying to protect the habitat around Spring Island, besides just taking care of Spring Island. Because if we want Spring Island to remain what it is today, we've got to work with other nonprofits to help with education, that we help make sure that Chelsea Plantation doesn't become a high-density development. The Good Hope Plantation, that's 18,000 acres up above, continues to do that, because that'll connect us to Okeechobee Hunt Club. Okeechobee Hunt Club is 53,000 acres. It stretches from the landfill up here at the end of Snake Road all the way over to the Savannah River. So we have, when you look at this, and you see where we're located between the Ace Basin and the protection efforts that are happening along the Savannah River, we are within an area that's being protected of 336,000 acres. The catch is we just need to make sure we stay connected to that. So to do that, then that's where things remain. Continue to have happy sunsets. Nice pictures from Betsy Chafin and Tom Blagden. Thank you very much, and we're out of time.